Everyone, welcome back to another episode of Raising Good Parents. I am super excited today because I get to talk with Jessica Lahey. I had the pleasure of interviewing her about a year ago, and then we talked at that time about her book, The Gift of Failure, which is one of my all-time favorites. And if you look on the shelf behind me, I know there's a copy hiding back there somewhere, and I often give it out to parents, or if parents ask me for a book, especially like those entering the school age years and beyond. That's the book that I tell them to get. And so I've been talking with Jessica for a long time now because she's had a new book coming out, and it feels like for ages because when I first talked to you about it, it was before COVID, I think, and then 8 years happened in 2020, and so now your book, The Addiction Inoculation, is coming out, and it comes out April 6th, and we're going to give away some copies. But I wanted to talk with you about the book and the process. First and foremost, how are you doing in the midst of COVID and everything that the last year has been?
My experience of COVID has been a little different, I think, from most people's experience, mainly because I'm married to a infectious diseases physician and a medical ethicist. And
Yes.
so it's been a really I mean, it's been a fascinating year. It's been an interesting year. It's been a very busy year. It's also been, a little eye-opening. He does a lot of press about, media. He gets on, in fact, he does this one conservative radio show where he tries to get on and debunk myths and stuff like that. And I was on my way home from a doctor's appointment when I came across a poster that said, Dr. Tim Lahey paid, oh crap, what did it say? It was something like paid liar is what it said. Dr. Tim Lahey, paid
Wow.
liar.
Oh
And,
my gosh.
if you had asked me a couple of years ago whether we would be in a position where my husband, who took a pay cut so that the essential workers at his hospital could get paid, because there have been shortfalls. COVID has been a disaster because it's bumped procedures, what's really the thing that makes hospitals money.
Right.
So he took a pay cut. He's been working really long hours. He's on the front lines. I sent my husband off to put on all this PPE so that he can come home to us safe. Um, and he's being accused of being a paid liar. And it's just such a bizarre world that we've been living in. So I'm out there, in
It
my
is.
gloves, ripping posters down. I could never have predicted this. But on the other hand, for me, I spend a lot of my time out on the road speaking to parents and at schools. And of course, that was shut down. And so I've had to do what a lot of teachers, although believe me, I know it's been much, much harder for teachers daily in the classroom, but, figuring out how all the online stuff works and having just a lot of time at home. And I can't see my parents and all that sort of stuff. And because I happen to be married to someone who knows the data so well, we have not gone to a restaurant. We have not left the
Right.
state. We have not, we follow the rules to the letter. And that can be a frustrating experience when there are so many people who are not. So that's
I
been our
can totally
last year.
understand where you're at with feeling
Yeah.
frustrated with people that have not. And both of you have been very active on Twitter and other places that I've seen and follow both of you and seen that journey. So please, know that our thoughts and everything is with you and with him too, because that's hard to be in the position for both of you. And so,
And
ugh,
if you follow me on Twitter, I've only lost my mind. I've only like blown my stack like once, maybe twice.
right.
And it was when, our last president started going after doctors and that kind of
Hmm.
stuff just drives me bananas. Like, come at me all you want, but come at my people, and I have a lot of trouble, keeping my cool. So, yeah. Yeah,
Totally
I
understand
am
that.
getting a little dose of what it's like for my husband when people come after me. Like, I can totally handle that, but he gets so protective, when I get backlash in the press. And
Mm.
this was my first real experience seeing that through his eyes, and it's it's really hard to not want to just shake people. So yeah, it's
It is really hard.
temperance has been the calm, stay calm.
Well, and I read your piece about the silver linings and those sorts of things that I think most people can find some silver linings, and that helps a little bit. And one of the things that's been exciting for me is to watch this book come to fruition and get to the point where it's getting published. So I would love
It's
to
been a
talk.
long road.
Well,
Long road.
take me through, because The Gift of Failure is a really good book for parents, just to know, how to set expectations for their child and their family, and to set them up for success by allowing them to fail. And the addiction inoculation, sounds like a very different subject matter. So,
Yeah.
talk me through the process of deciding to write this book, and then we'll talk about addiction and how to raise children in a culture of dependency.
So when I sold The Gift of Failure, and Gift of Failure came on the heels of a viral article in The Atlantic, and I was writing, so I was teaching full time in middle school, an
Okay.
overly full schedule. I was teaching 7 unique preps. It was bananas.
Wow. Yeah.
I was teaching, three grades of Latin and 2 grades of English and 2 grades of writing. And I was an advisor. It was a lot. And at that same, and it was a really stressful time, because as a full-time teacher and a full-time writer and a mother and a wife, I had these very carefully delineated boxes in my life, mainly because I was an alcoholic. Also, I was drinking too much, way too much, and keeping that separate from the rest of my life was becoming increasingly difficult. And while the alcohol never, leaked into my day jobs, mainly because I was so careful, but I was losing the ability to control that. And so right at that same time, my dad confronted me about my drinking, and I went into recovery, and I've been in recovery for over 7 years now. And
Wow.
so so that happened. And so in the background of all the stuff that I was doing, all the press and speaking and doing all that wonderful stuff for Gift of Failure, I was also new in recovery. And about a year in, just about the time when people start to get their heads together in recovery, about a year in, I volunteered to go speak at an adolescent adolescent rehab, drug and alcohol rehab. And I sort of spoke to the kids, and then I looked around at the end of the day, and at the end of the meeting, and I was like, wait a second, if these kids are here 24/7, they have to go to school here. And is there an education program here? Because I wasn't teaching full time anymore. And I was aching to get back in the classroom. And it turns out that it's true. The Department of Education of Vermont takes care of all of that. And because the focus is rehab, school is only 2 hours a day, every day. And I became their writing and English teacher, but also taught a little bit of everything. And I did that for 5 years. So in that time, I was continuing to write a column for the New York Times, and exploring lots of things, and talking to my agent constantly about what's the next thing going to be. And there's the fear of sophomore slump, and there's the fear of not having another idea. And she didn't put any pressure on me, and I kept pitching her things, and she kept saying, not quite, but keep going, keep thinking. And one day I was on my way to speak just outside of Boston, and around the Concord tolls in New Hampshire, I had to pull off the side of the road, because like all of these things that had been swirling for about 5 years just kind of came together in that one moment. And I had the title, and I knew what the book would be. And I texted my 2 best friends, who are my podcast co-hosts at the #AmWriting podcast, Serena Bowen and KJ Delantonia. And I texted them, and I said, I've got it. I know what this is going to be. And you'd think like, oh, now it's going to happen really fast, right? But it was a year to write that proposal, because it's a tough topic. And there was a very good chance that my editor would say, no, this is too thin slice. This is not a big book. This is whatever. So we had to be ready to go out to other publishers. And so it took me a year to get to the point where I could even write the proposal. And then it took another year after that to write the book. And then COVID hit. And well, and it wasn't even COVID, actually. It was just so hard to get any media traction during the Trump administration. So we just decided to postpone until Trump was out of office. And that was fortuitous, because COVID also hit, and it became really difficult. So here we are. Finally, the book's been done since a long time ago. October,
I
I
remember
think.
now.
I mean,
I
a year
remember
ago. I
because
mean, it's been done for ages, but it's also been really a great time for me because I've been working on other projects, and my third book is actually already in progress, but
oh my
which I'm not
gosh.
really talking about yet. Yeah.
Yeah. I
So,
remember that
yeah, it's
because
been a very long
it was
road, and I appreciate everyone's patience with me talking about substance abuse with sort of no book to say, here, this is what I've been talking about for years. So,
now in the book you talk through everything along addiction, and kind of, I mean, it's a huge topic, and there's a lot
mhm.
wrapped up in it. It's not just the child. It's not just the parent. It's the history, and there's so many different components to it. It's the outside influences too. So, I mean, how did you start, or where did you start with in this process? Like, how am I going to share information in a way that helps to break this culture of
Mhm.
dependency, and just walk me through that.
So actually, that's the first thing that happened was my agent said this is too broad. And she was
Mm-hmm.
absolutely right. So, the process of writing a book proposal actually is frustrating because it feels like you're not getting anywhere in terms of like selling the book. When's that going to happen? But for me, it's a really essential part of shaping what the book is. So the book is all prevention. There's nothing in
Okay.
there about treatment. There's nothing in
Okay.
there about when you get to the point that you think your kid might have a problem, and how you're going to deal with that, and which was freeing and also frustrating because I do love that other half of the topic. There's so much over there, but for me it allowed for a much more sort of focused dive into the phrase. The people, the experts in substance use disorder say we know prevention works, that substance use disorder is preventable, but what does that mean? What does that mean to me as a parent? What does that mean to me as an educator? There was some shocking stuff I figured out. I found out about what we're actually doing in schools and what we could be doing in schools, and how
Mm.
anyway, only 59% of schools are have any kind of substance abuse prevention program at all. And of that 57%, only 10% are evidence based. So,
Mm.
holy moly. Or parents seem to understand that opiate prescription opiate abuse is an issue, yet only 10% of parents are talking to their kids about what's in the medicine cabinet and how to handle that and all that sort of stuff. So I just wanted to know, both as a parent, as an educator, as a parent of just any old kid, but also specifically for me as a parent of two kids who are genetically predisposed to a substance use disorder during their lifetime. And
Right.
thank goodness for, people like Nadine Burke Harris who are getting stuff about ACEs out there.
Mm-hmm.
So the book is a lot about what we really, it's, if you picture one of those old timey scales, the scales of justice scales. On one side, you have risk factors, and on the other side, you have preventative factors. And taking a really clear-eyed look at our individual kids' risk factors, and then in response, that is not scary. What that is information, and
Mm-hmm.
information is power, information is control. So what do we do with that information, and how do we heap preventions on them, and what preventions work and what doesn't work, and what's hooey and what's what
Right.
has good research behind it and what doesn't, what's just animal models, what are human models, all that kind of stuff. So it was a deep dive, but I have such a fun job. I mean, I have the best job ever. I get interested in a topic, I go research it, and to become a complete dork for 3 years, wading around in the research, and then I get to translate it for a popular audience. It's the best job ever.
I love that, and I mean, I can tell how passionate you are about it, and the personal history obviously plays a huge role in that. Can you talk a little bit about the risk factors, and like
Mm-hmm.
what should the parent think about in terms of these are the significant risk factors, and these are things that I really don't have to worry about?
Yeah. So, and it's so often it's not, I don't need to worry about it, but I need to think about it differently. So
Sure.
the common, let's start with the obvious stuff. There's like the early risk factors for kids tend to be things like academic failure, early aggression towards other kids, social ostracism. But then we're in a situation where those things can get really tangled up. And so the earlier we intervene on those things, the better, because, you can assume that, aggression towards other kids can very easily lead to social ostracism. And then we end up in this tangled up thing that's hard to untangle. We have to look at adverse childhood experiences. We have to think about our own family history and our own use when we're looking at our child's risks, which is the hardest part, I think, for most parents, is to be really honest. And I talk a lot about what it was like growing up in a home where we just weren't allowed to talk about the very obvious, very large, very scary, very frustrating elephant in the middle of our living room, which was a parent's substance abuse, and lots of other people in the family as well. Mm-hmm. And that was, there was gaslighting, and there was, obfuscating, and there was lying, and there was euphemisms. Oh, and I think that really leads to why I hate euphemisms so much. I like having truth. And it turns out that this is, when we get there, that's one of the biggest preventative factors we can give to kids, is real truth and data and knowledge. But so we have the stuff I talked about in early childhood, adverse childhood experiences. And then we get to other things like, there's a school of thought around trauma. We talk a lot about, there's a saying that, genetics is sort of 50 to 60% of the picture. It's there. It's not destiny. A lot of people talk about, and I hate this analogy, but it is apt, that, genetics is the bullet and in the gun, and trauma's the trigger. So most of the kids in my substance abuse, in my rehab classroom, if I were to give them an ACE quiz, adverse childhood experience quiz, most of them would be somewhere around 7, 8, 9, most of the time. I always had kids in there with undiagnosed learning issues or late diagnosed learning issues. I almost always had kids in there who were coming out of the foster care system, who had lived in group homes. I almost always had a kid in there who had been sexually abused. And because I'm their writing teacher, this is the stuff they're writing about. In fact, I wrote an essay for creative nonfiction called "I've Taught Monsters." And it's one of my favorite things I've ever written, because it's not, the kids aren't the monsters. It's about the fact that we teach. Stephen King says that his subconscious knew he had addiction issues before his sort of the front part of his brain knew he had addiction issues. And so he wrote about them in the guise of Annie Wilkes, the horrible nurse in Misery, or, the Tommy knockers, the cocaine aliens that get in your brain and make you hyperkinetic. So we talk about, we turn in the rehab, we would turn the kids' adverse childhood experiences and their drug into their addiction into a monster and write about it. So those are the big things: the ACEs, genetics, the undiagnosed learning issues, that kind of stuff. And then, having a clear-eyed look at that, and then saying, okay, well, if my kid has lots and lots of risk factors, what am I going to have to do to outweigh that? How do I get my old-timey scale to balance somehow, given all of that? And my kids came out of the uterus, with a 50 to 60% chance of having a lifetime substance use disorder issue. Right. What do I do about that? And how do I take a really clear-eyed look at their risk and give them as much protection as possible?
Well, let's talk about that, because I think there's a lot of people and probably a lot of people that are hearing this and thinking, okay, I do, my child does have some of those risk factors, maybe not all of them, but certainly some of them, family history being a really common one. What should, and maybe can we do it in a chronological order, like first 5 years, second 5 years? Would that be a helpful way to go through it?
Well, and that's actually how it's outlined in the book. I think because it's so important to approach this stuff from a place where your kid, you're following along with your kid's cognitive and sort of moral development and all that kind of stuff. Right. And because people say, well, this is a really scary topic. How do I broach the topic of drugs with my kids? And it's like the sex talk in that it's not one talk. It's
Hmm.
not like your kid hits middle school and suddenly you start talking about drugs, because frankly, if you're waiting until middle school, you're waiting too late, because when you look at sort of the zone in which kids are going to start trying drugs, it is middle school. So if we're waiting until middle school, then we're waiting too late. The
Right.
good news in terms of prevention is that really great evidence-based effective substance abuse prevention programs are at heart really great social emotional learning programs. So
So they go together.
those programs, yes. And when I looked at the history of like school nursing and resources for health in schools, really all of these things go hand in hand to get to a point where now we understand the importance of good social emotional learning programs. We now are in a place where school counselors are uniformly have master's degrees in counseling, and they're a really great resource if overworked and overburdened. School nurses are a really important part of this picture, and of course this is me looking at the education side, but really good programs that deal with the whole health of the kid will naturally end up in a place where they start talking about putting things in our bodies that
Right.
can harm us. But it doesn't
Right.
start with drugs. It starts with the little kid who's sitting on the counter next to you while you're brushing your teeth or doing your makeup or whatever it is your kid is sitting there watching you do, and you're talking about stuff, and you talk about, why do we spit out the toothpaste instead of just swallowing it? Or your kid is learning their letters and there's a pill bottle for a prescription you're taking on the counter, and you say, can
Mm.
you find the letters of mommy's name on that prescription label? Why do you think mommy's name has to be on that prescription label? Because we don't take things that aren't prescribed for us, because this is specifically for
Wow.
mommy because of mommy's disease and how much mommy weighs and how tall mommy is and mommy's health. This is not a prescription for you. This is a prescription for me, and it's really important. So those are the kind of conversations we have, like why we wash our hands, and right now during COVID is a really interesting time because we're naturally talking about a lot of things that we're doing,
Sure.
not just for our own health, but to protect the other people around us. So it's a great time to be having conversations around medicines and what we take and what we don't, and why it's important not to take things, And there's funny stories too. Like there's David Sedaris tells a story in one of his books about the fact that his father took the antibiotic that was prescribed for his Great Dane because he's like, it's all antibiotics. And those kind of funny conversations, horrific to an infectious disease physician sitting in the other room,
Right.
but funny, those are the kind of conversations we have with our kids, and they don't listen to us when we lecture. They don't listen to us when we, aren't talking to them at the level that they need to be. So those conversations from very early on graduate, and especially good social emotional learning programs and good programs like, for example, in Botvin's life skills, moves developmentally with the kids so that when we need to start talking about tobacco, which is earlier than you would think, because kids are being advertised to from a very, very early
Sure.
age. And then on top of that, you have to layer on top of that, the kids who grow up in a home with substance abuse are a lot more savvy than we give them credit for. There's a study that shows that among kids who have a parent with a drinking problem, 4-year-olds can tell the difference between alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages. I tell
Wow.
the story in the book about when I used to work in pediatric HIV medicine. I used to work in research with the CDC and at Duke, and we had a little girl whose parents did not want her to know her HIV status, and this was in 1994. It was just after 076, and some there was still a lot of stigma. And what we came to find out was that the girl already knew she had at what, of course, for them really was a terminal illness at that time. But she asked her nurse not to tell her parents because she didn't want her
Oh.
parents to worry. Kids are
Oh.
so much
They are.
smarter and savvier than we give them credit for. I could tell as a young child from behind without even seeing my parent who drank, whether or not my parent was sober. So
Sure.
we kids know stuff. And so coming to them at a developmentally appropriate level, remembering, of course, that there's stuff that we're hoping they're not seeing, which they absolutely are seeing from a younger age. So those really great SEL programs, and parents, this doesn't even have to be something that happens through school. Parents can have access to these programs too. There's all kinds of great online resources through a lot of these organizations that offer these really great programs. And then there's lots of little things that I thought were just fun to investigate. There's some evidence that having a pet can help with all kinds of issues, from depression to, helping a kid name their emotions. There are studies about sometimes reading to animals can help a kid overcome their fear of reading. There's, so I'm curious, does that help with prevention? Well, it turns out that it's plus minus on some of the research. We do know that animals help lower blood pressure and release oxytocin and all these other fun things. So sure, we adopted another dog when we were, when I'm dealing with very specific risk issues with my kids. So for example, transitions are another big risk factor for kids. We know that summers are a time when kids tend to try things if they've never tried drugs before. Transitioning between middle school and high school, or high school and college, are big times of risk. And we moved, another huge risk for kids. We took him away from a peer group that he knew and whose parents I knew and trusted. I trusted these people to raise my kid. Now we're moving to a place where I know no one. So what am I going to do during that period? I'm going to be super vigilant. We're going to get a new dog because I figure, why not? We're going to do a lot of very specific things during that period. So, and I looked at peer groups. The party line is that peer cohort is one of the biggest risk factors for substance abuse. And I instinctively thought that can't be that cut and dried. And there's an entire chapter on how it's not that cut and dried. There are not just confounders in the statistics, but a whole bunch of reasons that if you have a kid who's interested in taking drugs, then probably their sober friends are not going to want to hang with them, and they will be attracted to other kids who are also interested in taking drugs. So it's not as simple as if my kid makes friends with someone who uses drugs, they're going to take drugs. In fact, the entire chapter on peers is about my then high school kid's relationship with a kid who had gotten thrown out of 3 high schools for his behavior and his behavioral problems and his drug use. And when my first instinct was, I'm shutting that down. That relationship is over. And he very wisely said to me that he thought it was really important for him to stay friends with this person because he is a sober, steady influence on his friend. And he has faith that his friend can stay in recovery and stay sober. And so my son, I don't know, 10 years from now, I may look back and say, well, that was a dumb decision. But right now, it appears that my son's relationship with this person was not only a stabilizing influence for the boy, Brian, who's in the book, it also was an incredible cautionary tale for my own kid. And a really up close look at what can happen when you let your substance use get away from you and where those lines are. So,
wow.
There are so many things that I would love to say, yep, peer group, keep your kid away from other kids who do drugs.
Right.
But
not
it
so
is
simple.
not that simple. And, the world is not that simple of a place. And I am suspicious anytime anyone says, gives a blanket, and I know that there's going to be a lot of things having to do with this book that people are going to come back at me and say, you should have called it a brain disease. You should have called it a developmental condition. You should have called it a trauma-based blah, blah, blah. But there's so many camps, and I wanted to address all of them and not just ignore them because they didn't make sense to me at first blush. So sorry, that was a very long-winded answer for the fact that there is no one correct, just like there's no correct recovery for everyone. I got sober in 12-step. 12-step recovery is not for everyone. It worked for me, but I am going to be supportive of someone who's taking a medication-assisted therapy. I'm going to be, one of the people in the book, Georgia, who was so generous with her story. When she was pregnant, she was on methadone because at the time that was the best way for her to stay I'm putting the word sober in quotes because some people won't call that sober, but some people will. And, it's just a whole big mess. And the best I can do is come at all of those with a very clear eye and report on them, be a journalist about them. And that's what I tried to do.
I mean, what you have said there just speaks to me, because it seems like, well, you just keep them away from certain people, or just prevent them from being exposed, and you can put them in this cocoon and protect them. And we know that doesn't work for other things. So why would it work for avoiding substance abuse?
Right.
When you titled the book "The Addiction Inoculation," I think of the inoculation as, this vaccine. And so what I'm trying to get at is there's a public health component to this as well. And so if you can take what you have learned from researching and writing this book and say, what would the ideal support system at the public health level look like to prevent this in children? I mean, how would you do that?
Yesterday,
what would that
or day before yesterday, I was doing an interview, and for the purposes of this answer, got to be the queen of the world. So if Jess was queen of the world, what would it look like? Right. But backing up really quickly about the title. So in the last year and a half, the AP changed its style manual, rightly so. And so many news outlets have changed how they talk about these words. So technically, I should not be using the word addiction. What I should be using is the word substance use disorder. You try writing a title that has substance use disorder and is catchy and works. So, and I address that in the book. So mea culpa, but addiction is the word.
No, I like the title. I'm all about
and then
titles,
inoculation. And inoculation, actually for a while we weren't going to use the title because it's hard to say. Addiction inoculation is a mouthful. But to me, that really is what it is, because I'm trying to, partially it has to do with exposing kids to a lot of information, a lot of evidence, a lot of prevention and there is the added piece to this, which is that inoculation theory is a big part of what I talk about in this book, because inoculation theory, and I get into in great depth in the book, is this wonderful resource where if we inoculate kids give kids answers, rebuttals to things like, well, everybody does it, it's no big deal kind of thing. When we help them rehearse, when we give them answers to those sort of statements, rebuttals to that statements, it helps kids feel empowered. And when we help kids feel empowered, it turns out that when we inoculate them against, oh, come on, just try a puff, everybody does it, it's no big deal. We also inoculate them more generally against other risky behaviors. It turns out, when we inoculate a kid against the risk of taking drugs and alcohol when their brains are uniquely plastic and vulnerable to outside influences, chemicals, we also inoculate them against, early sexual behavior and other risky behaviors. It generalizes, which is massively useful. So that word inoculation comes from inoculation theory, as well as, the idea of a vaccine. And that's not just because I'm married to an infectious diseases doc. And now I've completely forgotten your question that came after the part about the title. Oh, Queen of the World. Yes, I love being Queen of the World.
Yes, what would you do? Right.
Well, the hard part is Queen of the World would say, number one, we need mental health resources for everyone, and we need them to be accessible, and we need them to be adequate, and we need them to be there for everyone. And, coming at writing this book while knowing, especially now during COVID, that is not true. Everyone, all of my friends who are clinicians, mental health clinicians, are overburdened, have a waiting list for spaces. It is a terrible time to try to get mental health resources for kids. On the other hand, the fact that we're in a more virtual environment, the fact that a lot of these resources can be done online, can be accessed online, is great. We have access to, school counselors and school nurses. We would have more school counselors. We would have more school nurses. Every school would have at least one school nurse on the grounds at all time. There would be great integration between community resources and in-school resources. We would be dealing with adverse childhood experiences before they even there would be no, child sexual or physical abuse. There would be no neglect. We would overhaul the entire foster care system. Kids would not be kicked out at 18. It would be extended to 21 in all states. I mean, where do I even start with all of this?
Right, right.
Essentially, it's all about the earlier we deal with the stuff that is the trauma that makes it so that kids have an emptiness. I quote Chris Herron in the book, who had been a Boston Celtic and was addicted to opiates, and while he was actually one of the Celtics, and he now speaks in schools all over the world. And he has this great line, which is, we focus so much on the last use, like my last drunk, what that was like on the last day. But what we need to focus on is the first day. What is it that makes the kid not feel included, wanted enough, so that they take that drink so that it will give them liquid courage? What is it? How do we give them the courage and the feelings of self-esteem and the feelings of self-efficacy and the feelings of agency so that they don't need to reach for something that eases that angst? And I talk about that angst actually as part of our own human development. A lot of people believed that it was bread that allowed us to come together and become a more complex society, go from hunter-gatherers to an agrarian society. But there's another school of thought, which is it was the beer that was served at feasts that allowed loosely connected societies to come together in a more hierarchical way. And hierarchy creates social hierarchies. Hierarchies create anxiety. So it was the beer that allowed people to have that liquid courage to overcome those hierarchies and move forward as a society. The irony, however, is that the thing that for 90% of the population works great to bring people together and to be communal and to celebrate, for 10% of us, it's what drives us into the deepest, darkest isolation we can even imagine. And it is only through reconnecting with people that we can get out of it. A lot of people talk about the fact that addiction is the opposite of connection. That it's not sobriety that's the opposite of addiction. It's connection. That's the opposite of addiction. And for me, that was very much true. I had drunk myself into a very isolated and closed off place because it had to be nobody knew. It had to be my secret, and I could only rely on myself. And it was only through connecting with other people that had those same issues that I was able to pull myself out. So helping kids feel connected, that's another big part of it. Giving them the tools to have self-efficacy, to feel like they can self-advocate, to connect and ask for help, to name their emotions. I mean, that's another big part of it too. So good SEL programs across the board. That's, if I'm queen, I'm going for everything, not just one
totally.
or two little things.
Well, I mean, that helps me as a pediatrician to know where my role in a child's life and in the community.
You get a whole chunk of a chapter, Mr. Pediatrician. You get a big thing because you do some of the most important stuff. You do ESPERT. You do other kinds of screening. There's a whole thing in the book about your child's healthcare provider as one of your greatest allies and how how screening works, why it works, what the research says about adults and children's willingness to have a pediatrician or some other healthcare provider as an ally, adolescents' willingness to view their healthcare provider as someone they can talk to about that stuff, and even how willing they are to know that you may have to talk to their parents at some point and giving them some control in how that happens. All of these things are within your domain, and they're so incredibly important. And when we chose our healthcare provider for our kid after our move, it was very much oriented around, is this person going to be an ally, and does this person screen adequately?
So what you're saying, what I'm hearing is those infectious disease doctors, they're getting all the glory right now, but it's really the pediatricians that are the apple in Jess Lahey's eye.
Absolutely. And, to the parents listening, please let your child have time alone with their doctor. Please do not speak for your child. Please let your child speak for themselves. And because your child may have a very different perception of what their symptoms are and what they're thinking. And please do not look over their shoulder when they're filling out those iPad questions. Those, the screening questions are a huge way that healthcare providers find out about possible risky behaviors so that they can have that opportunity to screen, to possibly, know when a referral is going to be necessary, to have these brief interventions about, to the answer to the question, have you ever been in a car with someone who's been drinking?
Right.
Those moments of brief intervention can spell the difference for your kid between, doing one dumb thing one time and understanding why it's something they can never do again.
That is so true in all the different ways that you just said. And from my experience, I can tell when kids have filled it, or when their parents have filled out the forms for them. I can tell when
Why are they doing that? It's crazy.
I can tell when they've done it in the presence of their parents, and we have chairs outside the exam room so that I can say, hey, is it all right if I have a few minutes with Jimmy without you in the room, just so that we can talk through things. I mean, I try and set the expectation that that's going to be the case as they grow, so that it's not a surprise or like, well, what did he fill out on the form that caused that? It's just kind of the standard experiences. Here's our check-in, which is too infrequent. And I want to make sure
because
that
they're
we're
worried about
covered.
what you're going to think. See, here's the thing. Parents are worried about what you're going to think, because from the time, and I talked about this in Gift of Failure, at a certain point, I was not getting a grade for my parenting, obviously, but I'm so used to getting grades for everything else that at first it was like, okay, I go and I get that growth chart for my kid and I can get a grade based on, where my kid is in relationship to their head size and their percentile and stuff. And then after that's over and there's growth curves don't matter as much, suddenly I'm looking to you, pediatrician, to tell me how wonderfully I'm doing, the fact that my kid is my kid reaching these benchmarks and blah, blah, blah. So if my kid says that, yes, they've been in the car with someone who's been drinking, I must be the worst parent in the world. And P.S., when you look at the research on autonomy supportive parenting and when parents are more likely to step in, when you tell parents that other parents will be judging their kids' work after the experiment is over, suddenly they go into overdrive and they're super directive because they can't stand the idea. I can't stand the idea that other parents are going to be judging my child, or that you as a pediatrician are going to be judging my child and therefore judging my parenting and giving me some kind of, even if it's just in the back of your mind, a grade on what kind of parent I am.
Right.
So, I mean, if I can tell parents anything, it's that removing yourself from that process altogether will make it easier for you, because you don't have to stress about what those answers are, and know that those answers are only for the benefit of your child. And not giving direct and clear answers is as bad as, well, worse actually, than, you doing your kids' homework, because then nobody's learning anything. And, all you're doing is deceiving the teacher and pissing the teacher off. Let your kid have that space and time to do those. And I go through all the different kinds of screenings that, I tell parents what acronyms to listen for, whether it's HEADS or SBIRT or whatever the thing is, CRAFT or whatever, so that they can say, oh, good, my pediatrician is using that screening. It is useful, and I need to stay the heck out of it.
Love it. Such good information. The Addiction Inoculation comes out April 6th. I'm going to give away 3 copies on April 6th that you graciously said you would sign. If you want, if parents are listening to this and want to win, they can text the word book to 402-256-0768 and they'll be entered to win. And we'll get you those great copies of the book. I'm so excited for this. Thank you for taking the time to write this. I mean, I don't think that authors get enough thanks for all the work that went into distilling all this, because as a parent, as a pediatrician, I don't have the time, energy, or ability to synthesize that information the way that you do. And now I can just take that and say, here's where I can focus.
It helps that I have an in-house statistician. So if I have a study and I'm like, is this bogus or is this any good? I toss it over to him for a read through. But I'm sitting in a room with a box down by my feet that is filled with studies. I'm looking at 2, I'm a research dork. I love doing a deep dive into the research. It's so much fun. And it's like a puzzle, because everyone has a bias. Everyone has an angle. You got to look at where the funding is coming from and figure out where someone's trying to get and whether that's the right approach to what they're trying to study. And it's a really fun puzzle. So I'm just so grateful that I had the opportunity to do it. And, honestly, both of my books have been the books that I really needed as a parent and couldn't find. So it's been incredibly helpful to me. And now that I get to sort of put it out there in the world, I'm really just hoping that it changes things for kids. That's
It will.
my biggest goal for this book, is that more kids have access to really good substance abuse prevention programs, and even bigger than that, health programs that will keep them healthy, help prevent everything from, yes, substance abuse, but the stuff that we know adverse childhood experiences lead to, like strokes and early mortality and all that other stuff that's out there. I just want kids to lead healthy lives where they feel heard and seen and known for who they are.
That is so true, so well stated, and I know that you're going to do that with this book and everything that you do. So thank you so much. I'm so excited to see how this goes and share it with others. So I will get those signed copies out, and
Excellent.
so look forward to continuing along.
Thank you so, so much for your interest in the book. I'm so grateful.
You bet. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Before you go, will you hit the thumbs up like button, because that will make me feel great and it will make you feel great too. Hit subscribe so that you don't miss another episode. And if you have a question that you would like me to answer, just text me. It's 402-256-0768, and I will answer your questions live in an upcoming video. Keep up the good work.